On a January night in 330 BCE, one of the largest and most magnificent palace complexes ever built anywhere on Earth burned to the ground in a matter of hours. The fire moved through cedar roof beams brought from mountains 1,000 kilometers away, through halls whose stone columns had taken generations to quarry, carve, and raise, through storerooms holding a treasury so vast that the army sent to loot it before the burning needed thousands of pack animals just to carry the gold and silver away. By morning, the ceremonial heart of the largest empire the ancient world had ever assembled was ash and blackened stone. Ancient sources describing the wealth carried away before the fire mention figures difficult to fully credit even by the generous standards of ancient historiography, but even accounting for likely exaggeration, the scale of accumulated tribute represented something without real precedent, nearly 2 centuries of gold and silver flowing into a single treasury from 3 continents. An empire's accumulated surplus concentrated in one location and emptied within days by an army that had, until recently, been fighting for its own survival against the very power whose wealth it now controlled entirely. There is more here for you, if you would like it. If you find a place like this one, quiet, patient, built for the long dark of a winter night, consider subscribing, so the channel can keep finding you when you need it most. And for those who would like a little more, channel members receive early access to every documentary before it appears here, and a quiet way to support the slow work these stories take to make. Tonight, though, we go back to the mountain. The man who gave the order to burn it was Alexander of Macedon, fresh from destroying the army of the last Persian king and standing, for the first time, inside the palace his enemies had built to declare their empire eternal. What happened in the hours before that fire, whether it was a calculated political act meant to close a chapter of history forever, or something considerably messier and more human, a drunken party that spun out of control, depends entirely on which ancient writer you choose to believe, because the handful of accounts that survive contradict each other on nearly every detail that matters. Even the ancient sources closest to the event could not agree on whether Alexander meant to do it, regretted it immediately afterward, or planned the entire spectacle in advance as a message to every kingdom watching. This is the story of a palace built by kings who believed their empire would never end, carved with images meant to declare that permanence in stone, and reduced to rubble in a single night by the one man capable of proving them wrong. Tonight we walk through what those kings actually built, block by careful block, and by the end, you will understand exactly what was lost in those few hours, and why historians are still arguing, more than 2,000 years later, about whether the fire was an accident or an execution. The site the Persians called Parsa, and the Greeks later named Persepolis, meaning city of the Persians, sits on a natural stone terrace at the foot of the Ku-e-Rahmath mountain in what is now southern Iran, overlooking the fertile plain of Marvdasht. It was not the administrative capital of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. That role belonged primarily to Susa and, for parts of the year, to Babylon and Ecbatana, cities where the actual daily business of ruling an empire stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley was conducted. Persepolis served a different, more specific purpose, one that made it, in some ways, even more important than any city where taxes were actually collected. Darius I, who took the Achaemenid throne in 522 BCE after a period of succession crisis and rebellion across the empire, began construction at Persepolis around 518 BCE, choosing a site with no significant prior settlement, a deliberate decision to build something entirely new rather than adapt an existing city to his purposes. The location carried symbolic weight. This was the ancestral heartland of the Persian people themselves, the region from which Cyrus the Great had launched the conquests that built the empire 2 generations earlier, and building a monumental new capital here declared, in the clearest possible architectural language, that this dynasty intended its power to be understood as rooted in Persian identity itself, not simply administrative convenience. What Darius envisioned, and what his son Xerxes and grandson Artaxerxes I would spend the better part of a century continuing to build, was less a functioning city and more a ceremonial stage, a place designed for one specific, recurring purpose: to host the Persian New Year festival of Nowruz, when representatives from every subject nation across the empire would travel to this mountain terrace to present tribute to the great king in person, a ritual demonstration of loyalty and submission, performed in front of a physical monument built specifically to make that submission feel both awe-inspiring and permanent. The construction itself required resources and coordination on a scale that mirrors the empire's own reach. Cedar timber came from Lebanon. Gold arrived from Sardis and Bactria. Silver traveled from Egypt. Ebony and ivory came from Nubia and India. Skilled stoneworkers, drawn from across the conquered territories, worked alongside Persian and Median craftsmen, each contributing techniques and stylistic traditions from their own homelands into a single, unified architectural vision that Darius and his successors controlled and directed. The palace complex was, in this sense, built the same way the empire itself was governed, through the coordinated labor of dozens of subject peoples, working under Persian direction, to produce something that no single culture within the empire could have created alone. The specific choice to leave Susa as the primary administrative capital while investing such enormous resources into a purely ceremonial complex at Persepolis reflects a broader pattern common to several ancient Near Eastern empires, the deliberate separation of the practical machinery of taxation and governance from the symbolic architecture meant to represent that governance to the wider world. Susa handled correspondence, tax collection, and the day-to-day management of provincial affairs. Persepolis existed to be seen, approached, and remembered, a monument whose primary function was persuasion rather than administration, built to convince both subject peoples and the Persians themselves that the empire's dominion was not simply a temporary arrangement of military force but something closer to a natural, divinely sanctioned order of the world. The physical scale of what those workers ultimately produced remains difficult to grasp fully even standing among the surviving ruins today. The entire complex sits atop an artificial stone platform roughly 15 meters high, covering an area of more than 125,000 square meters, itself an engineering achievement that required leveling and reinforcing a section of natural rock terrace before a single column could be raised on top of it. Massive staircases, wide enough for multiple people to ascend side by side without breaking stride, provided the primary approach, their steps deliberately shallow enough that a person could climb the entire height on horseback, a detail some historians read as evidence that the stairs were designed specifically to accommodate the ceremonial processions the site was built to host. The most immediately overwhelming structure a visitor encountered upon reaching the platform was the Apodana, the great audience hall built primarily under Darius and completed under Xerxes, its roof once supported by 72 columns each standing more than 19 meters tall, capped with elaborate capitals carved in the shape of paired bullheads, griffins, or lions, designed specifically to cradle the massive cedar roof beams spanning the space below. The hall itself could reportedly accommodate up to 10,000 people, a space built not for the intimate private business of governance but for exactly the kind of large-scale, formal ceremony the empire needed to perform in front of its own assembled subjects. What made the Apodana, and the platform surrounding it, extraordinary was not simply its scale but the specific visual argument carved into nearly every available stone surface. Relief carvings running along the monumental staircases depict a procession of delegations from 23 subject nations of the empire, each group rendered in careful, distinct detail, their national dress, their weapons, their specific gifts all individually identified. Medes in rounded caps leading horses. Elamites bringing a lioness with cubs. Indians carrying gold dust and axes. Babylonians presenting fabric and a humped bull. Each nation appears once, in its own distinctive costume, carrying tribute specific to its own homeland, an enormous stone catalogue of everything the Achaemenid Empire had absorbed and now claimed as its own to command. The composition of this procession was not simply decorative. It was propaganda rendered permanent in stone, a visual argument that the diversity of the empire's conquered peoples represented not fragmentation but harmonious, willing participation in a single unified order, every nation bringing its finest goods forward not as extracted tribute from a defeated enemy, but as a gift freely offered to a king whose rule, the carvings insist, benefited everyone equally. Whether the actual lived experience of Achaemenid rule matched that carefully composed image is a separate question, one the stone itself, naturally, does not answer. The technical skill visible in these reliefs deserves attention on its own terms. Sculptors working in low relief on hard limestone achieved a level of anatomical precision and individual characterization rare among comparable monumental art from the period. Each delegation's clothing rendered with enough specific textile detail that modern historians of ancient dress have used the carvings as primary source material for reconstructing regional Achaemenid-era fashion. Horses led by Median grooms show distinct musculature and harness detail. The folds of Elamite robes fall differently from the pleated garments worn by Ionian Greek representatives standing nearby in the same procession, a level of ethnographic specificity that suggests the sculptors either traveled extensively or worked from detailed models and instructions provided by officials familiar with each subject people's actual appearance, rather than relying on generic or imagined depictions of foreign peoples the way some contemporary art from other ancient civilizations tended to do. The specific tools available to these sculptors, bronze and later iron chisels worked entirely by hand against unforgiving limestone, required an investment of skilled labor time difficult to overstate. A single relief panel of modest size could represent weeks of careful, painstaking work for an experienced carver, and the sheer quantity of surviving carved surface across the platform, staircases, doorways, and interior walls collectively covered in continuous relief work, represents a cumulative labor investment stretching across generations rather than any single reign. Each successive king inheriting an ongoing artistic project and adding his own contributions according to the same exacting visual standards his predecessors had established. Estimates of the total labor invested in the complete relief program covering Persepolis' surviving surfaces, extrapolated by modern art historians from documented carving rates for comparable ancient limestone relief work, suggest a cumulative investment easily running into the hundreds of thousands of skilled labor hours across the site century of primary construction. A figure that helps explain why the project required not simply the resources of a single reign but the sustained, multi-generational commitment of an entire dynasty determined to see its ceremonial vision through to completion regardless of how many individual kings' lifetimes the work ultimately spanned. Visitors approaching the terrace from its western side passed first through a structure built specifically to announce, before anyone had even glimpsed the palaces themselves, exactly what kind of place they were entering. The Gate of All Nations, constructed under Xerxes' I and completed early in his reign, stood as a monumental threshold flanked by colossal stone bull figures on its western face and human-headed winged bulls on its eastern side, guardian creatures drawing on a visual tradition with deep roots in Mesopotamian art but rendered here at a scale meant to dwarf anyone passing beneath them. An inscription carved near the gate, written in the three languages the Achaemenid administration used for official proclamations, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, records Xerxes' own words describing the structure's purpose in language that leaves little ambiguity about its intended effect. The gate, the inscription states, was built so that all the good that has been done, all of it has been done by the favor of Ahura Mazda, and so that anyone who saw it would understand the scale of what Persian kingship had achieved. It was not simply an entrance. It was a statement, positioned deliberately as the very first thing any foreign delegation encountered upon arriving, designed to establish, before a single word of formal diplomacy had been exchanged, exactly whose empire this was and exactly how permanent that empire intended to be. Beyond the gate, delegations would have proceeded through a network of courtyards and staircases toward the specific palace or hall relevant to their business, the complex organized less like a single unified building and more like a small city of interconnected ceremonial spaces, each constructed by a different king, each carrying its own specific dedicatory inscription identifying which ruler had commissioned it and, in several cases, explicitly listing the materials and origins of the workers who built it, a level of documentary specificity that few other ancient monumental sites anywhere in the world can match. The Takara, a smaller and more intimate palace built specifically for Darius I's personal use, stood apart from the grander ceremonial halls, its walls carved with images of the king himself attended by servants holding parasols and fly whisks, along with inscriptions in which Darius describes, in his own recorded words, the specific craftsmen and materials that built his palace, the stone masons from Ionia, the goldsmiths from Media and Egypt, the wood carvers from Sardis and Bactria, each nationality named individually, transforming the building itself into a kind of permanent labor record, a monument that documented its own construction with a specificity most ancient rulers never bothered to preserve. Xerxes' own palace, built to a scale roughly comparable to his father's Takara but incorporating architectural refinements reflecting decades of accumulated construction experience at the site, occupied a separate section of the platform, its surviving doorjambs still carved with images of the king attended by servants, along with a shorter, more personal inscription in which Xerxes explicitly credits his father Darius with beginning many of the complex's most significant structures while claiming credit for their completion, a small but telling piece of dynastic record-keeping that reveals how consciously each successive Achaemenid king understood himself as continuing and extending a multi-generational architectural project rather than simply building monuments to his own individual reign in isolation. At the heart of the wider complex stood the 100-column hall, sometimes called the Throne Hall, begun under Xerxes and completed by his son Artaxerxes I, a vast square structure whose name describes exactly what it contained, a forest of 100 columns arranged in a precise grid supporting a roof spanning an interior space nearly as large as the Apadana itself. Reliefs here depicted the king enthroned, receiving officials and holding audience, alongside scenes believed to represent the king in combat with mythical beasts, a symbolic assertion of royal power over chaos itself rendered in the same careful, formal style used throughout the site. Later in its history, this hall appears to have taken on an additional function beyond ceremonial audience, with archaeological and textual evidence suggesting it may have served, at least in part, as a military reception space and possibly a treasury annex during the later Achaemenid period. The empire's administrative needs gradually reshaping how even its most symbolically important spaces were actually used across the 2 centuries the site remained in active service. The specific engineering challenge posed by supporting a roof across this many columns, each one carved from a single monolithic piece of stone rather than assembled from smaller sections, required precise calculation of load distribution that modern structural engineers examining the surviving column bases have found genuinely impressive given the mathematical and material knowledge available to Achaemenid builders working entirely without the benefit of later architectural theory. The columns themselves, fluted along their shafts in a style showing clear influence from Ionian Greek architectural traditions absorbed into the empire following the conquest of Anatolia, represent yet another example of the deliberate stylistic synthesis that characterizes nearly every structure at Persepolis. Persian ceremonial purpose expressed through an architectural vocabulary assembled from across the full breadth of subject territories. Comparative analysis of column proportions and capital designs across the 100-column hall versus the earlier Apadana has allowed architectural historians to trace a clear evolution in structural technique across the decades separating the 2 projects. Later builders refining joint construction and load-bearing solutions based on accumulated experience from earlier phases of construction elsewhere on the platform, evidence of a genuine, evolving engineering tradition passed down through successive generations of royal builders rather than a static technique repeated without meaningful development across the site's century of primary construction. The treasury itself occupied a substantial section of the southeastern portion of the platform, a working storage facility rather than a purely ceremonial space, where the tribute gifts brought during Nora's processions, along with the empire's accumulated wealth in precious metal, were actually kept under guard. Excavation of this section produced some of the most historically significant textual evidence recovered anywhere at the site, thousands of clay administrative tablets recording payments, receipts, and inventories, a bureaucratic paper trail, or in this case clay trail, documenting the actual mechanical operation of running an empire this vast. Information considerably more mundane than the grand ceremonial imagery carved into the palace walls, but in its own way far more revealing about how Achaemenid administration genuinely functioned day to day. What these treasury records make clear, alongside a separate and even larger cache of administrative tablets discovered elsewhere on the site and now known as the Persepolis Fortification Archive, is that Persepolis functioned as considerably more than a stage set for an annual festival. Behind the monumental facades and the carefully composed tribute processions operated a genuine, sophisticated bureaucratic institution, tracking wages, rations, and the movement of workers and goods across the empire with a level of administrative detail that took modern scholars decades to fully catalog once the tablets were finally translated. The Persepolis Fortification Archive, discovered by archaeologists working the site in the 1930s, consists of roughly 30,000 clay tablets and fragments, most written in Elamite using cuneiform script, documenting the day-to-day administration of the region surrounding Persepolis across a period of roughly 2 decades under Darius I. What these tablets reveal, once painstaking decades of translation work made their contents accessible to modern historians, transforms Persepolis from a monument whose meaning could only be read through its grand carved propaganda into a site whose actual working population, their names, their jobs, and their compensation, survives in remarkable granular detail. The tablets record rations and wages paid to an enormous, ethnically diverse workforce, women alongside men, skilled artisans alongside unskilled laborers, individuals identified by name and by point of origin from across the breadth of the empire, Egyptians, Babylonians, Lydians, Cappadocians, Bactrians, and many others, all drawing pay for work performed in service of the crown's various construction and administrative projects. Several tablets record wages paid specifically to women workers, in some documented cases at rates comparable to men performing similar tasks, along with evidence of maternity provisions providing additional rations to women who had recently given birth, details that complicate any simple assumption about how thoroughly patriarchal Achaemenid labor administration actually was in practice, at least within this specific administrative system. Individual tablets record remarkably specific transactions, a shipment of wine authorized for a particular official traveling between administrative centers, grain rations calculated precisely according to the number of workers in a specific labor gang, travel permits issued to messengers carrying sealed correspondence along the empire's extensive road network, the kind of granular bureaucratic detail that, taken individually, seems almost mundane but that, accumulated across tens of thousands of surviving documents, builds a portrait of administrative sophistication rivaling anything documented in contemporary Mesopotamian or Egyptian bureaucratic traditions, despite Achaemenid Persia receiving considerably less popular historical attention than either of those better-known ancient administrative systems. The scribes responsible for maintaining this vast administrative record appear, based on the surviving tablets, to have worked in multiple languages simultaneously, with Elamite serving as the primary administrative language for the immediate Persepolis region, even as Aramaic increasingly functioned as a kind of common administrative language across the wider empire. Evidence of a genuinely multilingual bureaucratic apparatus capable of processing and translating information across the empires. Enormous linguistic diversity, a logistical achievement in its own right that receives far less popular attention than the more visually striking ceremonial architecture these same administrators helped coordinate and supply. The sheer bureaucratic sophistication documented in these tablets, tracking payments across an enormous, ethnically mixed workforce spread across multiple sites and projects, using a standardized accounting system precise enough that individual rations of wine, grain, and livestock could be recorded and audited, suggests an administrative apparatus considerably more advanced than the relatively simple image of ancient Near Eastern kingship might otherwise suggest. This was not simply a king issuing commands that subjects obeyed. This was a functioning bureaucratic state, employing scribes, accountants, and administrators across multiple languages and regions, coordinating labor and resources on a scale that required genuine institutional infrastructure to sustain. What makes the survival of this archive particularly striking is the specific, almost accidental way it survived at all. The tablets were stored in rooms within the fortification walls at the northeastern corner of the platform, and when the eventual destruction of Persepolis came, the fire that consumed the palace's wooden roof beams and collapsed its ceilings appears to have baked and hardened many of the unfired clay tablets rather than destroying them outright. The same catastrophic event that ended the site's active life as an imperial capital inadvertently preserving, through intense heat, the very administrative records that would eventually allow modern historians to understand how that empire had actually functioned. For nearly 2 centuries, generation after generation of Achaemenid kings maintained Persepolis as the ceremonial stage for Nowruz, the Persian New Year festival celebrated at the spring equinox, when representatives from across the empire's subject nations traveled, in some cases thousands of kilometers, to participate in a ritual designed to reaffirm, publicly and visibly, the relationship between the great king and the peoples he ruled. The specific choreography of these ceremonies can only be partially reconstructed from the archaeological and textual evidence that survives, but the broad outline suggests an elaborate, carefully staged sequence of processions, sacrifices, and formal audiences, delegations arriving with their designated tribute items, moving through the gate of all nations, ascending the great staircases, and eventually presenting themselves before the king in the Apadana, their arrival and their gifts. Recorded in the very stone reliefs that still surround the site today, a permanent record of ceremonies that, in their living, performed form, existed only briefly each year before dispersing until the next spring brought delegations traveling the same routes again. The logistical undertaking required to actually stage this annual event deserves consideration in its own right. Delegations from territories as distant as the Indus Valley and Nubia needed months of advance travel time to arrive at Persepolis by the specific date the spring equinox demanded, meaning the empire's road network, including the famous royal road connecting Susa to Sardis and its various branches reaching further provinces, had to accommodate not merely the routine flow of administrative correspondence and trade but the periodic surge of official delegations, their gifts, their retinues, and the provisions needed to sustain them across weeks or months of travel, a logistical challenge that itself testifies to the genuine administrative capability underlying the empire's more famous ceremonial displays. Religious observance connected to Zoroastrianism, the faith most closely associated with the Achaemenid royal court, appears to have played a role in these ceremonies as well, though the precise nature of Achaemenid religious practice remains a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. Since the imperial inscriptions invoke the god Ahura Mazda consistently and prominently without providing the kind of detailed liturgical description that would allow modern researchers to reconstruct exactly how religious ritual and political ceremony intertwined during the Nowruz festivities themselves. What is not in serious dispute is the underlying political function this annual ceremony served. An empire spanning 3 continents, governing an enormous diversity of peoples, languages, and local customs, needed some mechanism for periodically reasserting its own coherence and legitimacy, a visible, repeated demonstration that the disparate territories under Achaemenid rule genuinely constituted a single, unified political order rather than a loose collection of conquered territories held together by military force alone. Persepolis, and the annual ritual performed within its walls, provided exactly this function, a stage built specifically to make imperial unity feel real, ceremonial, and permanent, even though the actual daily governance of the empire happened elsewhere, in Susa and Babylon and the network of administrative centers that kept the empire's actual business running through the rest of the year. The specific texts Darius and his successors chose to inscribe throughout Persepolis reveal something further about how these kings wanted their rule to be understood, both by their own subjects and, in a sense, by anyone who might encounter these words in the distant future. foundation deposits discovered buried beneath the corners of several major structures, including gold and silver tablets inscribed with trilingual text in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform, record Darius's own account of the extent of his empire, listing the territories under his rule from the Indus Valley to the edges of Europe, and framing his authority explicitly as a gift granted by Ahura Mazda. One inscription, attributed to Darius and known to modern scholars by its catalog designation DPD, includes a passage in which the king asks for divine protection specifically for the land of Persia, a plea framed in terms that suggest genuine, sincere concern for the homeland's continued prosperity. Positioned alongside the far more triumphant declarations of conquest and dominion that dominate most of the site's other inscriptions, a small glimpse of something closer to personal anxiety. Embedded within the otherwise relentlessly confident public rhetoric of Achaemenid royal ideology. Other inscriptions catalog the king's own list of virtues in language that reads, to modern eyes, almost like a formal royal resume, Darius describing himself as skilled with both bow and spear, a capable horseman, a just ruler who punishes wrongdoing according to law rather than personal whim. Formulaic declarations that nonetheless establish a specific ideological template for legitimate Achaemenid kingship that later rulers, including Xerxes and Artaxerxes, would continue echoing in their own inscriptions across the site, suggesting a deliberately maintained continuity of royal self-presentation passed down and reaffirmed across multiple generations of rule. The specific vocabulary Achaemenid kings chose for these formulaic self-descriptions reveals something about the values their court considered essential to legitimate rule, physical capability and martial skill, certainly, but paired consistently with an equally strong emphasis on justice, truthfulness, and the deliberate rejection of falsehood, a term that recurs throughout the inscriptions with enough frequency that some scholars have identified opposition to the lie, understood as both a moral and cosmic category connected to broader Zoroastrian religious concepts of order and chaos, as a genuinely central pillar of how Achaemenid kingship understood and presented its own moral legitimacy to the wider empire. The trilingual format itself carries its own significance. By inscribing the same text in 3 separate languages and writing systems, each associated with a different major population within the empire, Old Persian representing the ruling dynasty's own ethnic identity, Elamite representing the region's older administrative tradition, Babylonian cuneiform representing the sophisticated literate culture of Mesopotamia. The Achaemenid kings were making a specific, deliberate statement about the multicultural character of their rule, presenting their authority not as an imposition of one culture's language and tradition over conquered others, but as something legitimately expressed across multiple linguistic and cultural traditions simultaneously. Modern decipherment of Old Persian cuneiform itself, a script that appears to have been specifically developed under Darius for the purpose of these royal inscriptions rather than inherited from an older tradition, depended heavily on exactly this trilingual format, since scholars in the 19th century were eventually able to use the Old Persian text, considerably simpler in structure than either Elamite or Babylonian cuneiform, as an entry point for cracking the far more complex writing systems inscribed alongside it, a decipherment achievement in the history of archaeology roughly comparable in significance to the Rosetta Stone's role in unlocking Egyptian hieroglyphics. By the time Alexander of Macedon crossed into Asia in 334 BCE, the Achaemenid Empire that had built and maintained Persepolis for nearly 2 centuries was, in ways not immediately visible from the palace's still intact splendor, considerably more fragile than its monumental architecture suggested. A series of succession disputes, provincial rebellions, and increasingly costly wars against Greek city-states had strained the empire's resources and cohesion in the decades leading up to Alexander's invasion, even as the ceremonial machinery at Persepolis continued, outwardly, to project an image of unshaken permanence. Alexander's campaign moved with a speed that caught much of the Persian leadership genuinely off guard. Victory at the Battle of Issus in 333 BCE, followed by the decisive defeat of Darius III's forces at Gaugamela in 331 BCE, effectively broke the Achaemenid military's capacity for organized resistance, and Darius III himself fled eastward, eventually to be assassinated by his own subordinates rather than face capture. An ignominious end for the man who had inherited the throne of Cyrus and Darius the Great. The scale of the Persian military defeat at Gaugamela deserves particular attention, since it represented not simply a lost battle but the collapse of the Achaemenid Empire's capacity to field the kind of overwhelming numerical force that had defined Persian military strategy for generations. Ancient sources, admittedly prone to exaggeration on both sides of this specific conflict, describe Persian forces vastly outnumbering Alexander's considerably smaller and more disciplined Macedonian army, and Alexander's decisive victory despite this numerical disadvantage effectively demonstrated, to every subject nation watching the outcome, that Achaemenid military supremacy, the underlying force that had made the empire's ceremonial claims of permanent, unshakable authority credible for nearly 2 centuries, could no longer be taken for granted. Darius III's own conduct during and after Gaugamela became, in later Greek and Roman historiography, a subject of considerable moralizing commentary, ancient writers frequently contrasting the Persian king's decision to flee the battlefield once his position appeared compromised with Alexander's own consistent pattern of personally leading cavalry charges at critical moments throughout his campaigns, a comparison that later Western historical tradition would use repeatedly to construct a broader narrative contrasting supposed Persian decadence and weakness against Greek and Macedonian martial virtue, a framing modern historians increasingly recognize as reflecting ancient propaganda and later Orientalist bias considerably more than any objective assessment of either individual leaders' actual military competence or personal courage. With Persian resistance collapsing, Alexander's forces moved through Babylon and Susa before finally advancing toward Persepolis itself in January of 330 BCE. According to the surviving ancient accounts, the approach to the city was not entirely uncontested, with some level of Persian defensive resistance at a mountain pass known as the Persian Gates, where a smaller Persian force under a commander named Ariobarzanes reportedly delayed Alexander's advance for a period before ultimately being overcome. One of the last organized military actions of the Achaemenid Empire's final months. When Alexander's army finally reached Persepolis, the city and its treasury fell into Macedonian hands largely without further significant resistance, and what followed, according to nearly every surviving ancient account, was among the most systematic and thorough plunderings recorded anywhere in the ancient world. The wealth accumulated within the treasury across nearly 2 centuries of tribute, taxation, and imperial accumulation was reportedly so vast that ancient sources describe needing thousands of pack mules and camels simply to transport it away, an almost unimaginable quantity of gold and silver representing the accumulated wealth of an empire that had, for generations, drawn tribute from 3 continents. What happened next, the specific sequence of events that led to Persepolis burning to the ground, is where the ancient sources that survive begin to diverge from each other in ways that have never been fully reconciled, leaving historians more than 2,000 years later still genuinely uncertain about Alexander's actual intentions that night. The most vivid and most frequently retold account comes from the historian Diodorus Siculus, writing several centuries after the event, who describes an elaborate victory banquet held within the palace itself, wine flowing freely among Alexander's officers and soldiers, when an Athenian courtesan named Thais, present among the party, reportedly proposed, in the midst of the drinking and celebration, that the assembled Greeks and Macedonians should burn the palace of Xerxes, the very king whose forces had burned Athens more than a century earlier during the Persian invasion of Greece, as a fitting act of revenge performed by Greek hands on the soil of the empire that had once tried to destroy them. According to this account, Alexander himself, caught up in the wine and the spectacle, personally threw the first torch, with his soldiers following his lead, the fire spreading through the palace complex in a night that began as celebration and ended in irreversible destruction. Diodorus's account includes enough specific narrative detail, the identification of Thais by name, her subsequent romantic involvement with Alexander's general Ptolemy, who would later found his own dynasty ruling Egypt, the description of the procession of torch-bearing revelers moving from the banquet hall out toward the palace itself. That many historians have questioned whether this level of dramatic specificity reflects genuine historical memory transmitted through reliable sources, or whether it represents exactly the kind of embellished, morally instructive anecdote that later Greek and Roman historians frequently incorporated into their narratives, a story too satisfying in its symbolic revenge structure, Greek fire avenging Persian fire exactly where the original offense had been committed, to entirely trust as unembellished historical fact. The historian Arrian, writing from different source material and generally regarded by modern scholars as one of the more reliable ancient authorities on Alexander's campaigns, offers a considerably more sober and more calculated account, suggesting that Alexander burned the palace as a deliberate, premeditated act of policy, a calculated political statement intended specifically to declare, in the most visible and unambiguous way available to him, that his war of revenge against Persia for its earlier invasions of Greece had been formally and finally completed, that the destruction of Xerxes' great ceremonial capital served as the symbolic conclusion to a century-old conflict between Greek and Persian civilization. Plutarch, writing later still and drawing on multiple earlier sources including versions of the Thais story, adds further detail while introducing his own ambiguity, noting in one passage that Alexander reportedly regretted the destruction almost immediately after it occurred, an admission of remorse that sits uneasily alongside Arrian's account of calculated political intent, and that raises the genuinely unresolved question historians continue to debate. Was the burning of Persepolis a spontaneous act of drunken excess that spiraled out of anyone's real control, or a carefully considered political decision that Alexander later found convenient to publicly regret once its consequences, including the destruction of a city he may have intended to preserve and rule from, became fully apparent. Modern historians examining these conflicting ancient accounts have generally settled into two broad interpretive camps, neither of which can claim decisive, conclusive proof from the surviving evidence, a genuine historical uncertainty that the passage of more than 2 millennia has done nothing to resolve. The political calculation interpretation points to several pieces of circumstantial evidence that seem, at minimum, consistent with deliberate intent. Alexander had, throughout his campaign, consistently framed his invasion of the Persian Empire as an act of pan-Hellenic revenge for Xerxes' earlier destruction of Athens and other Greek sanctuaries during the Persian invasion of Greece a century and a half earlier, propaganda that helped hold together the fragile coalition of Greek city-states nominally supporting his campaign. Under this reading, burning Xerxes' own ceremonial capital represented the natural, symbolically appropriate conclusion to that specific propaganda framing, a deliberate bookend to a stated war aim rather than an unplanned accident. Some historians pursuing this interpretation further note that Alexander's subsequent behavior, continuing eastward to hunt down Darius III and eventually assuming increasing elements of Persian royal ceremony and dress himself, suggests a ruler thinking carefully and strategically about how to transition from conqueror to legitimate successor, and that the deliberate destruction of the previous dynasty's most symbolically important ceremonial monument might represent an early, calculated step in that broader transitional strategy, clearing away the physical embodiment of Achaemenid legitimacy before beginning the more delicate work of establishing his own. Proponents of the spontaneous drunken destruction theory point instead to the specific, vivid narrative details preserved in Diodorus and echoed by Plutarch, the presence of a named individual courtesan, whose personal role in instigating the burning would be an unusual detail to invent if the event had actually been Alexander's own carefully planned decision from the outset, and the reported subsequent regret, which sits more naturally alongside an account of impulsive destruction than alongside genuine premeditated policy that achieved exactly its intended propaganda effect. A third interpretation, gaining increasing traction among historians in recent decades, suggests these two explanations may not actually be mutually exclusive. Alexander may have arrived at Persepolis already harboring genuine ambivalence about the palace's fate, weighing the propaganda value of its destruction against the practical value of preserving an intact, functioning imperial capital he could potentially rule from himself, and the drunken banquet, whatever its specific origin, may have simply provided the immediate occasion and social permission for a decision Alexander had already been quietly leaning toward: the wine and the crowds. Enthusiasm resolving an internal deliberation rather than creating an entirely new intention from nothing. Under this reading, the fire was neither purely spontaneous nor purely calculated, but something closer to a decision reached through the specific, unrepeatable social dynamics of that particular night, one that no single ancient account, written by authors working from different sources decades or centuries after the actual event, can be expected to capture with full accuracy. The archaeological evidence recovered from Persepolis itself, while it cannot resolve the question of Alexander's intent, does provide considerable physical confirmation of the fire's genuine scale and intensity. Excavations conducted primarily during the 1930s under the direction of the German archaeologist Ernst Herzfeld, and continued by his successor Erich Schmidt working on behalf of the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, uncovered extensive layers of ash and charred wooden debris across multiple major structures, evidence consistent with a fire severe enough to collapse roofs and damage stone surfaces across a substantial portion of the ceremonial complex. Notably, the destruction was not perfectly uniform across every structure on the platform. Some buildings, including portions of Darius's more modest Takara Palace, show comparatively less severe fire damage than the grander ceremonial halls like the Apadana and the 100-column hall, a pattern that some archaeologists have suggested might support either the spontaneous theory, since a chaotic, drunken burning might plausibly spread unevenly depending on which buildings the celebrating soldiers happen to reach with torches, or alternatively the deliberate theory, since a calculated campaign of destruction might specifically target the most symbolically significant ceremonial structures while sparing others of lesser propaganda value, evidence that, characteristically for this entire question, supports multiple contradictory interpretations depending on which underlying assumption a researcher brings to it. Erich Schmidt's excavation reports from the 1930s documented the specific pattern of ash deposits and structural collapse across different sections of the platform in considerable technical detail, noting variations in ash depth, the presence or absence of vitrified brick indicating especially intense localized heat, and the specific pattern of column and roof collapse that helps modern archaeologists reconstruct which sections burned most fiercely and which experienced comparatively lighter damage, technical evidence that, while extensive, has not resolved the underlying question of intent any more definitively than the ancient literary sources have, since physical burn patterns can be consistent with multiple different scenarios of how and why the fire actually spread. What the fire did not destroy entirely, somewhat ironically, was the very administrative archive that has proven most valuable to modern historians attempting to understand the site. The intense heat that baked and hardened the unfired clay tablets of the fortification archive, preserving records that might otherwise have crumbled to dust over the following 2,000 years, represents one of archaeology's stranger inadvertent gifts, catastrophic destruction that simultaneously destroyed a magnificent palace and preserved, through that same destructive heat, the bureaucratic paper trail documenting how that palace's empire had actually been governed. The treasury itself, having already been systematically emptied of its portable wealth before the burning occurred, according to the ancient accounts, suffered fire damage to its structure but had already lost the specific contents, the accumulated gold and silver tribute of nearly 2 centuries, that had made it the empire's most valuable single physical asset. Whatever symbolic value the burning held, the practical looting had already been completed, meaning the fire's destruction, whatever its cause, primarily consumed architecture, art, and administrative infrastructure rather than the movable wealth Alexander's forces had already secured and carried away toward Susa and, eventually, further campaigns deeper into the collapsing Achaemenid Empire. Persepolis did not entirely vanish from human memory or human presence after 330 BCE, though its role as an active ceremonial and administrative center effectively ended with the fire. Some limited settlement and activity appears to have continued in the surrounding region across the following centuries, and the ruins themselves, too massive and too solidly constructed to simply disappear, remained visible on the landscape, gradually accumulating local legend and folklore that increasingly disconnected the site from any accurate historical memory of what it had actually been or who had built it. By the medieval period, local tradition in the region had come to associate the ruins with the mythical king Jamshid from Persian legendary history, giving the site the name by which it is still commonly known in Iran today, Takht-i-Jamshid, meaning the throne of Jamshid, a name that reflects how thoroughly the specific historical memory of the Achaemenid dynasty and their purpose in building the site had faded from popular local understanding across the roughly 2,000 years separating the fire from later scholarly rediscovery. Islamic-era geographers and travelers writing in the centuries following the 7th century Arab conquest of Persia occasionally mentioned the ruins in their accounts, describing the massive columns and carved figures with evident wonder, while offering explanations for the site's origin that mixed genuine local memory with legendary elaboration. Some accounts attributing the construction to supernatural beings or ancient kings from pre-Islamic mythology, rather than preserving any accurate connection to the specific historical Achaemenid dynasty that had actually commissioned the site nearly 1,000 years before these particular writers encountered it. European travelers began visiting and documenting the ruins with increasing scholarly seriousness from the 17th century onward. Figures like the Italian traveler Pietro della Valle, who visited in the 1620s and made some of the earliest careful copies of the cuneiform inscriptions covering the site's surviving walls, providing raw material that European scholars would spend the following 2 centuries gradually working to decipher. These early copies, however imperfect by later archaeological standards, represented crucial documentation of inscriptions that would, in some cases, continue to deteriorate through subsequent centuries of weather exposure before more systematic conservation efforts began. Subsequent European visitors across the 18th century, including diplomatic envoys, merchants, and independent scholarly travelers making the long journey specifically to see and record the ruins, gradually built up a body of drawings, measurements, and inscription copies that circulated among European antiquarian circles increasingly fascinated by the site's evident grandeur and by the tantalizing, still largely unreadable script covering nearly every surviving surface, a puzzle that captured scholarly imagination decades before anyone possessed the linguistic tools necessary to actually solve it. The Danish explorer Carsten Niebuhr, visiting in 1765 as part of a broader scientific expedition across the Middle East, produced particularly careful and accurate copies of the trilingual inscriptions that would later prove instrumental to the eventual decipherment effort. His methodical, painstaking documentation representing exactly the kind of patient scholarly groundwork that later breakthrough achievements in ancient language decipherment consistently depended upon, even though Niebuhr himself would not live to see the script he so carefully copied finally yield its secrets to the generation of scholars who followed him. The 19th century brought increasingly serious scholarly attention, with the decipherment of Old Persian cuneiform script, achieved gradually through the work of multiple European scholars working with the trilingual inscriptions Darius and his successors had left throughout the site, opening the door for the first time to actually reading, rather than simply admiring, the specific words these ancient kings had chosen to carve into the walls of their palace. This decipherment breakthrough, building on comparative analysis of the same texts rendered in 3 different scripts, provided scholars with the linguistic foundation eventually necessary to tackle the far more complex Elamite and Babylonian cuneiform traditions as well, transforming Persepolis from a site of romantic ruin and vague historical association into a genuine primary source for understanding Achaemenid history in the ruler's own recorded words. Systematic scientific excavation of Persepolis did not begin in earnest until the 20th century, when Ernst Herzfeld, a German archaeologist with extensive prior experience working across the broader Near East, secured permission and funding, substantially supported by a major grant from the Rockefeller Foundation channeled through the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, to begin the first comprehensive, methodical excavation of the site starting in 1931. Herzfeld's excavations, and those continued by his successor Erich Schmidt after 1934, uncovered the vast majority of what visitors to Persepolis can see today, clearing centuries of accumulated debris and collapse from the major structures, documenting the extensive relief carvings in careful photographic and written detail, and, in 1933, discovering the fortification archive tablets that would eventually revolutionize modern understanding of Achaemenid administrative practice once decades of. Subsequent translation work made their contents fully accessible to historians. Herzfeld himself brought to the project extensive prior experience excavating other significant Near Eastern sites, and his methodical approach to documentation, insisting on detailed photographic and written records of each excavation phase rather than the more haphazard treasure-hunting mentality that had characterized some earlier archaeological work across the region, established documentation standards that Schmidt would continue and refine after taking over direction of the project, ensuring that the excavation, unlike some contemporary digs elsewhere in the world, produced a scholarly record detailed enough to remain useful to researchers working nearly a century later. Funding for the excavation, secured substantially through the persistent advocacy of James Henry Breasted, founding director of the Oriental Institute, who successfully convinced John D. Rockefeller Jr. of the project's scholarly significance, reflects the broader pattern of early 20th century American philanthropic investment in Near Eastern archaeology, a period when major American cultural and educational institutions were actively competing with longer-established European archaeological programs to establish their own significant excavation projects and associated scholarly reputations in the region. Schmidt's tenure also introduced aerial photography to the excavation, an innovative technique for the period that allowed the full scale and layout of the platform complex to be documented and understood in ways ground-level survey alone could not easily achieve, providing archaeologists with a comprehensive spatial understanding of how the various palaces, halls, and administrative buildings related to each other across the full extent of the artificial terrace. The excavation work of the 1930s, while producing enormously valuable scholarly results, also occurred within a period when international archaeological practice still frequently involved the export of significant artifacts to museums and institutions outside the host country, a pattern that has generated ongoing conversations in subsequent decades about cultural heritage, ownership, and the appropriate location for studying and displaying materials originally recovered from Iranian soil. A number of the fortification archive tablets, loaned to the University of Chicago for translation and study under an agreement with the Iranian government, remained the subject of legal and diplomatic discussion for decades afterward, with portions gradually returned to Iran across subsequent years as translation work was completed, a slow, complicated process reflecting the broader, still unresolved tensions between international scholarly access and national cultural patrimony that affect archaeological sites and their associated artifacts around the world. Persepolis today occupies a position of profound significance within modern Iranian national identity, a status formally recognized when the site was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1979, though its cultural and symbolic importance to Iranians had been firmly established decades before that international designation arrived. The most historically notable modern moment connecting Persepolis to contemporary Iranian politics occurred in October of 1971, when the Pahlavi monarchy under Mohammad Reza Shah staged an enormous, internationally attended celebration at the site marking what the government presented as the 2500th anniversary of the founding of the Persian monarchy by Cyrus the Great. An elaborate multi-day event involving heads of state and dignitaries from around the world, staged tent cities constructed specifically for the occasion, and a deliberate, carefully choreographed effort to position the modern Pahlavi state as the direct inheritor of Achaemenid imperial grandeur, using the ancient ruins as a literal physical backdrop for a modern political statement about legitimacy and historical continuity. The logistics of the 1971 celebration were extraordinary in their own right. A specially constructed luxury tent city featuring imported French designers, catering flown in from Paris, and security and hospitality arrangements built to accommodate dozens of visiting heads of state and royalty, all staged directly adjacent to ruins that had stood silent and largely unvisited for the better part of 2,000 years. The ancient platform suddenly transformed into the backdrop for one of the most expensive and most internationally scrutinized diplomatic events of the entire Cold War period. Contemporary press coverage of the event, both domestic Iranian and international, captured a striking visual juxtaposition that many commentators noted explicitly at the time: elaborately dressed foreign dignitaries processing past 2,000-year-old carved reliefs of tribute-bearing delegations, a modern diplomatic spectacle staged quite literally on top of an ancient one. The specific irony of rest-aging imperial grandeur at the exact site whose original grandeur had ended in fire and conquest apparently lost on few observers who understood the fuller history of the ground beneath their feet. The celebration proved controversial even at the time, criticized by many ordinary Iranians for its enormous cost during a period of significant domestic poverty, and viewed with considerable skepticism by segments of Iranian society who questioned the appropriateness of the secular Pahlavi monarchy claiming direct symbolic descent from a pre-Islamic imperial tradition as part of its own political legitimation strategy. The event has since become, in retrospect, one of the frequently cited examples of the excess and disconnect from ordinary Iranian life that contributed to the broader political tensions culminating in the 1979 revolution that ended Pahlavi rule entirely, only a few years after the elaborate 1971 celebration at Persepolis itself. Despite this complicated political history, Persepolis has retained its status as one of the most significant cultural and historical sites in Iran across every subsequent change in the country's government, drawing both domestic and international visitors to walk among the same columns and staircases that once hosted Achaemenid kings receiving tribute from across 3 continents. The site's specific historical significance as a monument to pre-Islamic Persian civilization continuing to hold genuine cultural resonance for many Iranians regardless of the shifting political uses to which its imagery has periodically been put by successive governments seeking to associate themselves with its ancient grandeur. Standing today among the surviving columns of the Apadana, or walking the wide monumental staircase where the tribute processions of 23 subject nations were once carved into permanent stone record, the physical experience of Persepolis carries a specific weight that photographs alone rarely convey. The mountain air at this elevation carries a clarity and a particular quality of light that shifts dramatically across the day, early morning sun catching the relief carvings at a low, raking angle that brings the carved figures into their sharpest possible definition. The same effect that likely made these images most legible and most impressive to ancient visitors climbing the staircase toward the gate of all nations at exactly this hour. Summer heat across the Marv plain builds intensely by midday, the exposed stone platform absorbing and radiating warmth that makes early morning or the hours immediately before sunset the only genuinely comfortable time to walk the site at length, a practical consideration that likely shaped, in its own quiet way, the specific timing of ancient ceremonial processions as well, since Achaemenid planners organizing an annual festival meant to impress thousands of visiting delegates would hardly have wanted their most important displays of imperial grandeur undermined by uncomfortable midday heat. The scattered still-standing columns of the Apadana rise now against open sky rather than the elaborate cedar roof they once supported, their capitals still displaying the paired bull and griffin heads carved to cradle roof beams that burned away entirely on that January night more than 2,000 years ago, leaving behind stone fragments whose original architectural purpose remains legible only to visitors who understand what has been lost from the space around them. Wind moves freely now through halls that were designed to be enclosed, intimate, and controlled, spaces built specifically to overwhelm visitors with contained grandeur that the open ruins can only partially suggest to a modern eye untrained in reconstructing what has been removed. The relief carvings themselves, remarkably well preserved in many sections despite the intervening millennia and the specific violence of the fire that consumed the wooden and less durable elements of the complex, still show the careful individual attention Achaemenid sculptors brought to distinguishing one subject nation from another, the specific weave of a garment, the particular style of a beard, the distinct breed of animal being led forward as tribute, details fine enough that modern historians have used them to help identify which specific delegation each relief panel was originally intended to represent, reconstructing, stone panel by stone panel, the full geographic reach of an empire whose administrative center this complex was never actually meant to be, only its ceremonial heart. What the burning of Persepolis actually represented, beyond the specific unresolved question of Alexander's personal intent that particular night, offers a broader lesson about the relationship between monumental architecture and political permanence that extends well beyond this single site or this single empire. Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes I built Persepolis explicitly to declare Achaemenid rule eternal, carving into permanent stone an image of unified, harmonious imperial order that they intended future generations, both Persian subjects and eventually, perhaps, distant observers separated by centuries, to read as evidence of a natural, unshakable political arrangement. The fire that consumed the site's wooden elements in a single night demonstrated, with brutal and immediate clarity, exactly how contingent that permanence actually was, dependent entirely on the empire's continued military and political capacity to defend itself, a capacity that, however overwhelming it must have appeared during the 2 centuries Achaemenid power dominated the ancient Near East, ultimately proved insufficient against a determined, capable opponent willing to press the advantage his own military success had won him. Stone carvings depicting eternal tribute and permanent submission survived the fire considerably better than the empire itself did, an irony that later historians and visitors to the ruins have returned to repeatedly across the centuries since. The specific images that survived the fire, the tribute processions still visible on the eastern and northern staircases of the Apadana, carry an almost unbearable dramatic irony once a visitor understands the fuller context of what happened here. 23 nations, forever captured in the act of bringing gifts to a king whose empire had less than 2 centuries left to exist when the carvings were completed, continue performing their permanent, stone-bound submission to an authority that ceased to exist in any functional sense on a single January night. The propaganda message frozen in place long after the political reality it was designed to reinforce had been reduced to ash and administrative tablets. Modern visitors familiar with this fuller history often describe experiencing the surviving reliefs with a specific kind of retrospective sadness absent from the original ceremonial intent, the carved delegates' expressions of formal, dignified submission reading, to contemporary eyes aware of what followed, almost like unwitting participants in a scene whose eventual ending none of them, sculptors or subjects alike, could have possibly anticipated when the work was first commissioned. This same pattern, monumental architecture built to declare political permanence, only to outlast the specific political order that commissioned it, recurs throughout the history of empires and civilizations across every continent, and Persepolis offers one of the ancient world's clearest and most dramatically documented examples of exactly this dynamic playing out within a compressed, well-recorded time frame. The stone survives. The relief carvings of tribute-bearing nations still stand, still legible, still carrying the specific propaganda message their original patrons intended. The empire that commissioned them, and the specific political order those carvings were designed to declare eternal, ended in a single night, its ashes settling over stone images of permanence that, by the cruelest possible irony, would go on to outlast the very system of power those images had been carved specifically to celebrate. The fortification archive tablets, still undergoing translation and analysis by scholars working primarily through the Oriental Institute's ongoing Persepolis Fortification Archive project, continue to yield new insights into Achaemenid administration even now, nearly a century after their initial discovery. A reminder that the site's most historically valuable secrets were not necessarily contained in its grandest, most visually impressive structures, but in the comparatively humble clay. Records documenting the ordinary daily business of running an empire. Recent decades of tablet translation have revealed increasingly detailed pictures of specific individuals who worked within the Persepolis administrative system, named scribes, named ration recipients, named travelers moving along the empire's road networks carrying official correspondence and authorization documents, transforming what was once understood only as an abstract imperial bureaucracy into a record populated by identifiable individual lives, however briefly and incompletely those lives can now be reconstructed from a single surviving payment record or travel authorization document. Among the specific insights this ongoing translation work has produced is a considerably more detailed understanding of the hierarchy of skilled labor operating within the Achaemenid construction economy, with tablets distinguishing between different pay grades for master craftsmen versus apprentices, specialists in stone carving versus general laborers, and administrators overseeing specific projects versus the workers actually executing them, a granular economic record that allows modern historians to reconstruct something close to an actual labor market operating within the broader imperial economy, complete with evidence of skill-based wage differentiation that complicates any assumption that ancient Near Eastern labor systems operated purely through simple compulsion rather than genuine economic incentive structures. This ongoing scholarly work occurs against a backdrop of continuing international cooperation and occasional diplomatic complexity, as remaining tablets on loan to American institutions gradually complete their translation work and, in accordance with long-standing agreements, return to Iran, a process that has continued in phases across multiple decades and multiple shifts in the broader diplomatic relationship between Iran and the United States, the tablets themselves remaining throughout. These political complications, a shared scholarly resource whose historical value transcends the specific diplomatic tensions periodically affecting the practical logistics of their study and eventual repatriation. Individual researchers who have spent entire careers working through this archive describe the specific satisfaction of encountering, tablet by tablet, evidence of ordinary administrative continuity, the same categories of payment recorded month after month, year after year, across the same routine bureaucratic patterns, occasionally interrupted by tablets documenting something genuinely unusual, an unexpected shortage, a specific individual receiving an irregular payment for reasons the surviving text does not fully explain, small human anomalies embedded within an otherwise remarkably consistent administrative record that collectively allow modern scholars a degree of intimacy with the daily operational rhythm of Achaemenid governance that few other ancient bureaucratic archives anywhere in the world can match in comparable depth and detail. What continues to emerge from this patient, decades-long translation effort is a portrait of Achaemenid Persia considerably more administratively sophisticated, considerably more ethnically diverse in its actual working population, and considerably more bureaucratically documented than the grand ceremonial imagery carved into the palace walls alone could ever have suggested. Evidence that the empire Alexander burned in a single night had been, for nearly 2 centuries beforehand, one of the most administratively complex and effectively governed political systems the ancient world had yet produced. However imperfectly that administrative sophistication survives in popular historical memory compared to the more dramatic, more visually striking story of the palace's eventual destruction. It is worth sitting for a moment with the specific asymmetry this creates in how Persepolis tends to be remembered. The fire receives the attention. The named courtesan, the drunken banquet, the single dramatic night of destruction, these details circulate far more widely in popular retellings than the considerably less cinematic but arguably more historically significant fact that this same site, for nearly 2 centuries before that fire, sustained one of the most sophisticated multilingual, multi-ethnic administrative systems the ancient world had yet produced. The destruction is memorable precisely because it was sudden, singular, and dramatic. The functioning empire that preceded it, precise, patient, and bureaucratically unglamorous, required 30,000 clay tablets and nearly a century of subsequent scholarly translation work simply to become visible at all. That asymmetry itself may be the truest thing this site has to teach anyone willing to sit with it a while longer than the story of a single burning night requires. The specific question of what Persepolis might have become had the fire never occurred remains one of the more genuinely interesting counterfactuals available to historians studying the transition between the Achaemenid and subsequent Hellenistic periods of Near Eastern history. Alexander's broader policy across his conquered Persian territories generally favored incorporation and adaptation rather than wholesale destruction, retaining local administrative structures, in some cases retaining local officials in their existing positions, and generally presenting himself, at least in certain contexts, as a legitimate successor to Achaemenid kingship rather than simply a foreign conqueror intent on erasing everything the previous dynasty had built. Had Persepolis survived intact, it is entirely plausible that Alexander, or his eventual Seleucid successors who inherited the eastern portions of his fractured empire after his death, might have continued using the site in some administrative or ceremonial capacity, incorporating Achaemenid imperial symbolism into their own claims of legitimate succession rather than simply leaving the complex in ruins. The fire, whatever its actual cause, foreclosed this possibility permanently, ensuring that Persepolis would survive in historical memory specifically as a monument to Achaemenid grandeur destroyed rather than Achaemenid grandeur adapted and continued under new management, a distinction that shaped how subsequent generations, both ancient and modern, would come to understand the specific relationship between Alexander's conquest and the civilization it replaced. Comparable examples elsewhere in Alexander's broader campaign lend some weight to this counterfactual possibility. In Egypt, Alexander was welcomed and crowned according to traditional pharaonic ceremony, incorporating himself into an existing religious and political framework rather than dismantling it. In Babylon, he similarly participated in traditional Babylonian religious ceremonies associated with kingship, presenting himself as a legitimate successor within an existing tradition rather than as a foreign destroyer. Persepolis represents the clearest exception to this broader pattern of adaptive incorporation, and the specific reasons why this particular site received different treatment than comparable centers of prior imperial legitimacy elsewhere in his conquests remains one of the more genuinely puzzling aspects of Alexander's broader approach to managing his rapidly expanding, ethnically diverse empire. Some historians have suggested this inconsistency itself supports the theory of spontaneous, unplanned destruction, arguing that a genuinely calculated policy of eliminating symbols of prior legitimacy would likely have been applied consistently across every major center of Achaemenid ceremonial and religious authority Alexander encountered, rather than selectively targeting only Persepolis while carefully preserving comparable institutions in Egypt and Babylon, a pattern of behavior that fits more naturally with an unplanned event specific to the particular circumstances of that one January evening than with any broader, systematically applied imperial policy. This counterfactual also highlights something genuinely uncertain about Alexander's own evolving self-conception during this specific period of his campaign. Ancient sources describe growing tension within his own army over his increasing adoption of Persian court customs and ceremonial practices in the years following the fall of Persepolis, tension that suggests Alexander himself may have been genuinely working through, in real time, exactly how he wanted to position himself relative to the Achaemenid tradition he had just militarily defeated, whether as its destroyer, its legitimate inheritor, or some complicated combination of both roles. Simultaneously, the burning of Persepolis, occurring relatively early in this broader process of Alexander's evolving relationship with Persian identity and kingship, may represent a moment before he had fully worked out which of these roles he ultimately intended to occupy, a decision made in the heat of a specific night's celebration or calculation that his later policies, in some respects, seem to have partially walked back or complicated. The tension between destroyer and inheritor never fully resolved itself during the remaining years of Alexander's life, and his death in Babylon in 323 BCE, before the empire he had assembled could fully stabilize into any single coherent successor state, left the question of what Alexander's Persia might ultimately have become permanently unanswered, his conquered territories fracturing instead into the competing Hellenistic kingdoms his surviving generals carved out for themselves in the decades of warfare that followed his death. The specific individuals who actually built Persepolis, the sculptors, masons, carpenters, and laborers whose names appear scattered throughout the fortification archive receiving their rations and wages, deserve consideration in their own right, separate from the grand dynastic narrative of the kings who commissioned their work. These were not enslaved captives forced into unpaid labor in the manner sometimes assumed about ancient monumental construction. The tablets consistently document payment, in the form of silver, grain, wine, and livestock, calculated according to specific rates tied to skill level and role, evidence of a construction economy that, whatever coercive pressures may have existed at the margins of Achaemenid labor relations, operated substantially through paid employment rather than pure compulsion. A master stone carver, according to surviving payment records, could expect wages considerably higher than an unskilled laborer hauling stone or mixing mortar, and specialists brought in from particular regions for their specific expertise, Ionian Greek masons whose techniques Darius explicitly credited in his own inscriptions, Egyptian goldsmiths whose metalworking traditions predated the Achaemenid dynasty by well over 1,000 years, Babylonian brickmakers drawing on architectural traditions stretching back to Sumerian antiquity. Each brought distinct regional knowledge into a single coordinated construction project, their individual contributions blending into a unified architectural whole while their separate cultural techniques remained, in many cases, still identifiable to modern art historians examining specific decorative and structural details across the site. The workforce required to construct and continuously maintain Persepolis across the roughly century-long primary construction period, and the subsequent decades of ongoing modification and expansion under successive kings, would have represented a substantial and sustained economic undertaking, drawing skilled and unskilled labor from across the empire on a rotating or seasonal basis according to patterns the fortification archive allows historians to partially reconstruct. Workers appear to have traveled considerable distances to participate in specific construction phases, their travel authorized and provisioned through the same administrative apparatus that tracked their subsequent wages and rations once work began. Evidence of a labor mobilization system considerably more organized and more centrally coordinated than casual assumptions about ancient construction projects might otherwise suggest. What this labor evidence ultimately reveals is that Persepolis was never simply the product of royal command imposed on a passive, undifferentiated mass of subject labor. It was built by identifiable individuals, paid according to documented rates, traveling according to authorized routes, executing specialized techniques drawn from their own distinct cultural and professional traditions, a genuinely cosmopolitan workforce whose collective, coordinated effort produced a monument that, in its own construction process, embodied the same multicultural synthesis the completed palace's carved tribute processions would later celebrate in stone. The specific artistic influences visible throughout Persepolis's surviving relief carvings offer their own quiet testimony to the empire's genuinely cosmopolitan character, a visual record of cultural exchange that predates and, in a sense, models the same multicultural synthesis the empire's political structure attempted to achieve at a governmental level. The winged sun disk motif appearing above several major doorways and inscriptions, generally understood as representing the divine glory associated with Ahura Mazda, draws visibly on earlier Egyptian and Mesopotamian solar and divine iconography, absorbed and reinterpreted within a specifically Persian religious and artistic context rather than simply copied wholesale from its source traditions. The Lamassu figures, human-headed winged bulls guarding the gate of all nations, similarly draw on an artistic tradition with deep roots in Assyrian and Babylonian palace architecture, where comparable guardian figures had protected royal gateways for centuries before Achaemenid builders adapted the motif for their own ceremonial entrance. A specific case of artistic borrowing that Achaemenid patrons appear to have embraced openly rather than concealed, incorporating a visibly Mesopotamian architectural convention into the entrance of what was explicitly designed as the definitive monument to specifically Persian imperial identity. Column capitals throughout the site, with their distinctive paired animal head design supporting the roof beams above, represent a genuinely original Achaemenid architectural innovation without clear precedent in earlier Near Eastern building traditions, suggesting that even as Persepolis's builders drew extensively on artistic and architectural vocabulary borrowed from across the empire's subject territories, they also generated genuinely novel design solutions specific to their own particular ceremonial and structural requirements, the palace complex functioning simultaneously as an archive of absorbed foreign influence and as a site of authentic new architectural invention. This pattern of selective absorption and genuine innovation extends to the site's overall approach to royal representation as well. Unlike Egyptian pharaonic art, which frequently depicted rulers at exaggerated scale relative to surrounding figures to emphasize divine or semi-divine status, or Assyrian royal reliefs, which often emphasized violent military conquest and the explicit subjugation of defeated enemies, Achaemenid royal imagery at Persepolis consistently favors a calmer, more formally composed visual language. Kings depicted at scale comparable to attending officials, tribute delegations rendered with individual dignity and careful ethnographic accuracy rather than as generic, dehumanized conquered peoples, a specific artistic choice that reinforces the broader ideological message of harmonious, willingly participating imperial unity the site's builders worked so consistently to project across every available carved surface. Tonight, the columns of the Apadana still rise against the mountain sky above the plain of Marvdasht, their carved capitals still cradling nothing but open air where cedar beams once supported a roof that sheltered 10,000 people during the ceremonies this place was built to host. The staircases still carry their careful procession of 23 nations, forever bringing gifts toward a throne that has not received tribute in more than 2,000 years, forever caught in the specific moment their sculptors chose to render permanent, unaware that the empire they were built to glorify had less than 2 centuries left to run. The fire that ended Persepolis as a living ceremonial capital burned for a single night in January of 330 BCE, and more than 2 millennia of subsequent scholarship, from the earliest confused local legends about the mythical king Jamshid, through the careful trilingual transcriptions of 17th-century European travelers, through the systematic 20th-century excavations that finally recovered the fortification archive from beneath the very ash the fire had left behind, has still not definitively resolved the question that mattered most to the people who witnessed it happen. Was it calculated policy, dressed up afterward in convenient stories of drunken excess to soften Alexander's later regret? Was it genuine spontaneous destruction, a night of celebration that spiraled beyond anyone's actual intention or control? Or was it something in between, a decision reached through the specific, unrepeatable social chemistry of one particular gathering, that Alexander himself may never have fully explained even to those closest to him? What survives, regardless of which account comes closest to the truth, is stone carved with an argument about permanence that the fire itself definitively disproved, and clay tablets, hardened rather than destroyed by the very heat that ended the palace's active life, that preserve, in granular administrative detail, exactly how the empire those stones once celebrated had actually managed to function for nearly 2 centuries before one night, one decision, and one fire brought the ceremonial heart of the ancient world's largest empire to a permanent, unrecoverable end. Somewhere in the wind moving across that open platform tonight, past columns that have stood exposed to sky for more than 2,000 years, past staircases still carrying delegates who will never complete their approach to a king who will never again receive them, The specific truth of what happened on that particular January night remains exactly as unresolved as it was for the soldiers who woke the next morning to find the palace they had celebrated inside reduced to smoke and blackened stone. Perhaps that unresolved quality is itself the most honest thing the ruins have left to offer, a reminder that even the most carefully documented ancient event can resist final explanation, and that some questions, however thoroughly investigated across 22 centuries of scholarship, may simply remain open for as long as anyone continues to stand here asking them. If this documentary has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.